Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. Today my guest is Red Sorensen. Red is from the Creston area. Welcome, Red. It's great to have you here. Red has published the autobiography called The Man Called Red. So I think that'll become evident as we talk about the book. So Red, tell me what inspired you to write your book, The Man Called Red?
Well, I knew nothing about my parents, and I knew absolutely nothing about my grandparents. And I have a family of 6 children, 4 boys and 2 girls. And my wife had a family of 15 children. And I thought it was imperative that they all learned about their grandparent, their father and their dad. And that was the motivator of writing the book.
Okay, so good for you, Red. You know, a lot of people have an interesting life, but they fail to write it down. So hats off to you for doing that. I was wondering, as I looked through the book, is it possible that you were a force ranger, you crashed a plane, you were a cowboy, all these things? Were you making it up, or is this for real?
It's for real. There's not a word in this book that isn't true.
Okay. So tell me about some of your experiences. What were you involved in?
Well, when I was small, I was born and raised in Calgary till I was 6 years old, and then we moved from there. And I always wanted to be a cowboy. And I used to ride around with the milkman in his wagon and learn about horses and whatnot. And then we moved to southern Alberta, and I worked on farms and whatnot, and worked during the war alongside German prisoners of war. And I worked enough to get myself $20 so I could buy a horse. Okay. And I've always had a horse all my life.
Right. So you also became a big guide hunter. Is that is that correct? So that was a little bit of a leap from the days when you just had a horse. How did that all transpire?
I homesteaded. I was a forest ranger. Actually, I went to the Chilcotin and the Caribou and learned how to be a cowboy. And I was a city kid, and it was tough learning, but I learned it as much as I could. I rodeoed, I farmed, ranched, and whatnot like that. And I was in a little town called Lexus Creek in the Caribou. And I happened to be chasing the forest ranger's daughter. And he said, there's no future in being a cowboy. He says, why don't you take a course and learn how to be a forest ranger? So I said, okay, why not? And so then I took this test in Williams Lake, and I passed it with high honors. And then when I come along to put me someplace, they informed me that all the jobs had been filled for that year, BC Forest Service. And so I just went back to being a cowboy, and then about a month later, he got a hold of me and he said, you've got to go to Fort St. John. You're going to be a forest ranger up there. So that's where I went. I went to Fort St. John and met my wife, which is a story in itself.
So let's just talk about your writing process. How did you remember all those details? How did you get them down on paper? Did you keep a diary, a journal?
No, I never. I wish I had it, or I wish my wife had it, but neither one of them did. And when I finally, I had a serious accident, and I decided that I had to print my book. I had to get it out. And so then I started looking at pictures, and during my occupation as a big game guide, I had written every year sort of a summary that I handed it to the hunters that I wanted to try to book. And putting that all together, I was able to bring back a lot of memories, and that's...
So the book is called A Man Named Red, so I see a little bit of silver now, so I'm assuming that there was some red hair there.
Yeah, there was a lot of red hair.
Okay. So was that sort of the standard nickname that people would identify you with?
The old man I went to work for when I first became a cowboy, the first thing he said to me, he said, what's your name? I said, Norman. He said, no, not, it's Red. Yeah. And that's how I got my name Red, and it stuck with me all these years.
Good. Why do you think it's important that people write down their memoirs or put this information down on paper so others can read it?
Everybody has a story to tell. I don't care what it is, they have a story to tell. And I think they should at least take some time, if not in a diary or in a book, at least put it down on paper so their families later on in life can know about them.
How long did it take you to write your book?
After I got hurt and decided that I better get at it, 2 years
Okay.
I spent.
What about the publishing process? What was that like to go through?
That was an experience. In Creston, I talked to some people about publishing, and they said, well, I'll get a hold of this certain lady. She's put out quite a few books, and she can probably guide you along the way. So I talked to her, and she seemed to be interested in it, and she said for $2,000 she would edit it and format it. And she had some ties with some publishers down in Victoria and Vancouver, and she thought the book should be printed. Well, this was fine, and after she made a rough drawings and whatnot of what she thought should be in the book, it looked like the book was going to be her book and not my book. And my book was going to be my book, and it was going to be done my way or not at all. And so we fell by the wayside there.
Are you pleased with the way it turned out now?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it tells your story the way you wanted it told?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Red, just talk about the fact that, you know, people have got memoirs, they've got ideas and so forth. What would you suggest that they do to record those memories?
Put it down on paper or on the computer, whatever way they were. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how are you promoting your book?
I have it on Amazon, and I have it with a publisher down in the United States. And I travel around and promote it that way at bookstores and museums and whatnot. I have probably 50 outlets in Vancouver, or in British Columbia, and in Alberta.
Right. Yeah. So, in fact, I met you at the Kimberley Farmers Market. So obviously, you're taking a proactive approach and promoting it there.
Absolutely.
So that's great. When it comes to self-publishing, it's always a challenge because you want to make sure that, you know, people get your book, but also that it's a quality product. Are you happy with the way everything turned out?
Yes, I had a personal friend that is a executive director of one of the largest hunting organizations in the world in the United States. And after I got finished trying to do something with publishers, I sent him a copy of the manuscript, and he took their executive, not executive, but their head editorial writer for their magazine, and had him go through it. He went through it, told me what I should be doing with it, never changed any words, told me what I should be doing with it, and I followed his advice.
Good. Always good to have those suggestions, those mentors that you can follow. Red, thanks for taking the time being a guest today. I know that it's a lot of work to get a book out, and I certainly congratulate you on putting out The Man Called Red. It's really captivates your life and the exciting things that went on throughout that lifetime. So thank you again for taking the time.
Well, thank you very much.
I'm Keith Powell, and this is Talking Kootenay Books. Welcome, this is Talking Kootenay Books. I'm Keith Powell, and our guest today is Bob Wakulich. Bob, it's great to have you here. I know you've got a lot of experience when it comes to writing. You're involved in the theatrical community in Cranbrook as well. Recently published some books online and also have a hard copy. I first met you over at Beers and Books, and and I really enjoyed your reading. Your writing has a bit of an edge to it, but also a fair bit of humor in it as well.
Yeah.
So tell me a little bit about your background.
Well, the first time I went to university back in the 70s, they didn't have creative writing programs at universities yet. I was editing the campus newspaper, and after I got my degree from Lakehead in Thunder Bay, I spent a few years just working on my writing by myself at home. And then I got an opportunity to go to the Banff Center to take the summer writing workshop, and that's when W.O. Mitchell was still running it. So he had this process for writing called freefall, where you just sit down and type whatever's in your mind, and then you worry about sorting it out later, which was actually a very good way to generate material. And it's still being, like, variations of that are still being used by a lot of people. It's mostly just to keep you writing, right? The idea that you need to write is okay, but the fact that you structure yourself kind of, and you start editing yourself as you write gets to be a real impediment to getting anything done. So after that, I've done journalism and written nonfiction and did a number of jobs in the 70s and 80s. And then in the 90s, I decided to go back to school because I found out that people would be willing to hire me to teach, but I didn't have the credential. So I went back and got another bachelor's degree in fine arts at UVic, University of Victoria, and then an MFA at UBC. Again, that was kind of an interesting time because George McWhorter was in the department there at that time, and he was really big on what he called experimental fiction, which was essentially trying to put unusual formats of writing, like not sticking to the normal sort of genres, but trying to mix them together. Right. So I had a lot of fun with that, and it was an interesting crowd back then. That particular group of people that went through the master's program, a lot of them ended up getting published and moving on and doing all kinds of other things. Oh, and I managed to get a job teaching after that, so it was okay.
So let's talk about your job teaching. You were at the College of the Rockies. What did you say? 14 years.
14 years, yeah.
So what was your responsibility there?
Well, with the college, their main concern was making sure they had their prerequisites to get into the program. So I spent a lot of time teaching composition. And studying the masters, right, kind of thing, doing poetry and the survey courses, first and second year survey courses, which kind of was one of the reasons I decided to do this chapbook, because I'd read the material so many times. I was almost channeling these guys. So also I did fine arts. I did teach an acting class, taught some film studies classes. These are all things that I had taken while I was going back to school in the 90s.
I see. So you're really involved in the creative process. How many students would typically be in a class? How many would you say that you would have influenced over the course of your career there?
Well, it's kind of funny because some of the composition students actually I had didn't even take creative writing from me and still ended up, getting into creative writing, which was kind of nice. I think the influence has to be is when you're dealing with students writing is that you have to convince them what they want to write about is worth writing about, because a lot of the times they're saying, well, I like to write but nobody wants to read what I'm talking about, and they can't see themselves as novelists or once you start worrying about genres, then you kind of tie yourself up in knots. If you have something you want to write it down. Leave it alone for a couple of days, have a look at it, see if it still entertains you, and if it doesn't, then move on to something else. If it does, work on it and see if it'll turn into something for you.
So you have a few books online, Smash Words and so forth.
Yeah.
Talk about that process. What's that all about?
Well, part of the problem with one of the things I did notice when I went back to school in the 90s was there were I had an opportunity to meet a lot of agents, and at that time it was kind of a youth movement. So once a lot of these agents found out I was over 40, that was the end of the conversation. But I did talk to some people who mentioned the fact that they had, like a few people I know who've gotten books published by big publishers, actually published on Smashwords and got picked up from there. So I mean, it's much the same as submitting a manuscript to a publisher. I mean, if it tweaks someone's interest, it may end up getting picked up. Right. So I had gone the route, and sent these manuscripts out for years and years. A couple of times they were accepted for publication, and then the publishers went under before they could publish it. So I was, rather than think I was cursed, I just kept, plodding away. And then the Smashwords setup now is actually quite beneficial, just in terms of promoting books. Right. and it's a good way. It's just a good way to see, to get some feedback from people about things you could tweak the thing with. That's the nice thing about Smashwords too. You can actually tweak the manuscripts if you decide that if you get enough feedback on it. So
it's almost an interactive experience.
Yeah, and it's one of the advantages of the internet. I'm not saying some people, it takes a while, in terms of posting it and getting feedback, but I have had some interesting comments from people who either downloaded samples or downloaded the actual books. Right? So,
talking about your chat book, let's explore that. When did that come out, and what was the sort of genesis behind that?
Well, it was published in spring of this year, 2017. It was just there was an announcement for a small publisher in Ontario was having a chapbook contest. Chapbooks, so people understand, it's just essentially a small book, a small collection of either poems or stories. It's usually less than 48 pages. It's meant more to promote the writer as well as the contents. Quite often a chapbook will have some kind of thematic. It'll be a suite of poems or a series of short stories or something like that. So I, just before Christmas, like say about October, November last year, I started thinking about writing in the guise of other authors, right? The idea, because I've done this before. I've done satires where I've written in the guise, written in the style of Leonard Cohen, or I wrote a not a nonfiction piece. I guess you just call it a humor piece, where I had 20 Canadian authors rewriting "The Rain in Spain Falls Mainly on the Plain" in their own way. So this was kind of a similar thing where I put together 17 poems written by various. They had to be deceased authors this time. It didn't have, So what would Allen Ginsberg think of cable service? What would Al Purdy think of the high-end restaurants? That kind of stuff, right?
Do you feel comfortable sharing one with us, or?
Sure.
Okay.
If you want, yeah.
Just put you on the spot here.
Yeah, that's okay. Let's see. Well, the other thing about doing this is you have to, when you're writing about contemporary issues using classic, the styles of dead authors, you have to sort of update their view on the world, and it's kind of funny because I think all writers borrow from other writers.
Sure.
It's just when you're doing this, you're being very obvious about
Right.
it. So this is William Carlos Williams analyzes reality television. With the ruthless indifference of bored executioners, we are drawn to these well-planned accidents invading our plasma displays between endless come-ons from surgically altered ambulance chasers, cheerful purveyors of theoretical food, and wonder drug hucksters. We know reality is something else, but concede that in our waning exposure to its charms, tedious suburban housewives, trust fund divas, spray tan control freaks, overcompetitive dandies, and other suppliers of repugnant delights will have to suffice.
Thanks, Bob.
Yeah. Okay.
So obviously you were able to get the chat book out. Any other plans for another publication?
Yeah, I put out one collection of columns I'd written for the Townsman, for the local paper here, humor columns. I've still got another collection that I'm putting together that's going to be released on Smashwords as well. Okay. And I've got a novel in progress, but my trouble with my novels is they usually take anywhere from 15 to 20 years to write. Okay. The first one I actually managed to get done took me over 15 years. So this is the third attempt, or third novel. Okay. So I guess I'm not going to be a Stephen King prolific writer, but I guess it's just the style I work in. It just and I think some people get scared off from writing because they think they have to crank something out.
And I wanted to ask you about that because you've influenced a lot of young writers in your teaching and your career, undoubtedly. You've learned from some of the best if you've had W.O. Mitchell as an instructor.
Yeah.
What advice do you pass on to aspiring writers?
This is hard to do when you're younger, but be patient. And also don't kick yourself too much. Like you basically, I think every day you write, you learn something that you didn't know the day before. and you can apply it to what you've already written. One of the worst things I think about writing is learning how to edit yourself. And if you're patient about that, and you're not trying to, treat yourself like you're some kind of idiot, because that's the problem, right? Some days you look at your writing and you think, what was I thinking, right? And then 2 weeks later, you look at the same material and realize, all I have to do is this, and it's great. So it's a hunt. It's like a treasure hunt. It's a search, except it's all your material, right? So that would probably be the best idea. Don't just be patient.
Good advice. Bob, thanks for taking the time to be a guest on our show today.
Okay, thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
And this has been Talking Kootenay Books. I'm Keith Powell. Welcome to Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell. I'm your host. I'm talking today to Dave Butler. Dave is our guest, and Dave has recently put together a new book. Dave, what is the topic of your new book? Let's start out. What is the title of the new book?
So the new book is called Full Curl, Keith.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about the book.
So it's a piece of mystery fiction. It's the first of 3 books in a series. It basically, the sort of main protagonist in the book is, I would say, a hard-edged, caustic park warden by the name of Jenny Wilson.
So what inspired you to come up with a mystery series based on that topic?
Well, it's actually loosely inspired by one of the cases that I was involved with when I used to work as a warden back in Banff National Park years ago. It's a story that I've always wanted to tell. Of course, it's mostly fiction, but it's based on a bit of a seed of truth, and I've really taken it and run with it and had some real fun. I'm really enjoying the fictional part of this because it just takes me to a different place, allows me to explore some new characters, some new perspectives, and also some of the issues that we face in Western Canada.
How did you get into writing, Dave?
I've been writing, Keith, nonfiction for many, many years, and I've always wanted to move into fiction. I actually was doing a travel writing course with Angie Abdu at the college, and Angie wanted to get what she called a directed studies course going, so she phoned and asked me if I was interested. And I had this book that I had kind of started years ago but put on the shelf, and it had about an inch of dust on it, and she persuaded me to pull it back out and use it in the directed studies course. So we actually had to do a chapter a week in the course, and she pushed me to keep going, was very encouraging and very positive about it. And by the end, I had a novel after taking the course with Angie. It was a fantastic experience.
Sounds interesting. So from that point on, you had to get a publisher. How did that all work?
Yes, as many authors will tell you, I have a large pile of rejection letters from publishers and agents. But once I finished the book, I took a step that I look back on now as a really good step, and that was I submitted the book to an awards program in back east through the Crime Writers of Canada. It's called the Unhanged Arthur Award. It's for the top unpublished crime fiction book of the year, and I was lucky enough to be shortlisted for that. So I went to a gala dinner in Toronto. Unfortunately, I didn't win, but fortunately, I was able to meet all sorts of wonderful people, agents, publishers, other writers, all of whom were very, very gracious. And it turned out that I met the folks at Dundurn Press, who's now my publisher, and after some conversations and some discussions back and forth, I ended up with a 3-book deal with them, which was more than I had even hoped for. Wow. So it was very exciting.
So this is the first of the series, is that correct?
That's correct. There's at least 3 in the series, and I've got 4 and 5 and up to 6 plotted out. So depending on how the first couple 3 do, I'm hopeful that I can keep the series going into many books.
Dave, can you give us some insight into the intrigue, the mystery that's involved in your story?
Sure. Well, what it is
without giving away the whole.
Yeah, that's always the secret of a mystery. It's really what happens is the main character, Jenny Wilson, discovers that there are animals going missing from Canada's national parks. So once she realizes this, she goes on she undertakes a complex investigation that really follows, it's a trail of deceit, distraction, and murder. And eventually, with the list of victims growing, both human and animal, she's really becomes in a race for justice, I would say. And ultimately, that takes her back and forth across the Canada-US border and takes her to a place that, in some ways she feels she might not come back from.
So I understand you're planning to launch a book at the end of September, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm really excited about that. So this is, we're going to have the launch on September 30th at Lotus Books in Cranbrook, BC. I'll do a bit of a reading, we'll have a Q&A, and hopefully sign lots of books for folks who might want to read them.
Sounds great. Can we just explore for a moment your writing style, how you go about writing? Do you consider yourself a disciplined writer? Do you write every day? How does that process work for you, Dave?
Like most writers, I've got other jobs I do, so you have to fit it in your spare time. But most of my writing occurs on weekends and evenings. I really try to, there's the joke about writing, whether you're a plotter or the other kind of writer, you just let things go. And I tend to try and be a plotter, but at the same time I'm finding with my characters now, they take me to some unexpected places. So oftentimes I'm finding I have great plans as to where a chapter or a sequence of chapters will take me, but the characters sometimes take me in different directions. So I try and do that. I try and get about a chapter a week done if I can, and then keep working on that. And then once I've got the book kind of finished, I usually do a number of major revisions. I send it out to some beta readers, so some folks who will read it for me. And then afterwards, the revisions continue, and then I have to get it into my publisher at a certain point, and there's deadlines for each of the 3 books in the series. So I try to get as much of that done as I can.
So you've written the first one. Are you in the process of writing number 2 and number 3?
Thanks for the question. Number 2 is actually done. I've finished, my beta readers have had a look. I'm in the process of doing the revisions on it now, and it has to be to the publisher by September 1st. So when I get to that point, then I'll be right into number 3, which is basically plotted out, but I haven't really started writing number 3 yet.
Interesting. When it comes to writing, how important are mentors, someone that you can sort of follow their example or sort of bounce ideas off?
Really important. From a writer's perspective, someone like Angie Abdu has been nothing but brilliant for me. She's really helped, pushed and prodded, and I've had some really great readers along the way who have really asked me the right questions and really focused on some things in the book that I might have missed, or asked certain questions that really got me thinking in a different direction. But most importantly, getting people who understand writing and understand reading, and reading is just as important, to be able to get them to look at it and say, this is how I read that, this is how I perceived it. And then that might help me to realize that maybe it didn't come across exactly the way I'd hoped it would, or I need to add more detail in a landscape or a character, that kind of thing. Super important.
Okay, good. Let's recap it and wrap this up. So name the book again?
It's Full Curl. It's the first in the Jenny Wilson mystery series.
So I'm taking it Jenny Wilson is the main character?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
And plays a central role throughout the book?
Yes, absolutely.
And you're anticipating it in the next series as well?
Yes, I think throughout this current series, the readers that I've had so far said she's a really interesting character, and they look forward to more in the series. So I'm looking forward to seeing where she takes me.
Well, I look forward to reading it myself, Dave. Congratulations on putting together your first book, getting a publishing contract. Full Curl will be out, as you mentioned, at the end of September.
Right. Thank you, Keith.
Thanks for being our guest. So this has been Talking Kootenay Books. My name is Keith Powell.